Okay, we are live now. We are live now.
Fellow yogis and all brothers and sisters who are watching on our Facebook Live, good evening and a warm welcome to our last Dharma talk by Patrick Khan, entitled The Fourth Satipaṭṭhāna. Patrick talked about the first three Satipaṭṭhānas yesterday night, but unfortunately, we cannot live stream it due to technical issue with the Facebook. But we managed to upload the recording in our Facebook before midnight, and I hope you have listened to it before tonight's talk. Otherwise, you can always go to our Facebook and listen to it. Patrick will start tonight's talk with chanting, followed by Dharma talk. I will now pass it to Patrick to start the session. Patrick, please.
Okay, let's begin with the chanting. Vandana Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Tisarana Buddhang Saranang Gacchami Dhammang Saranang Gacchami Sanghang Saranang Gacchami Dutiyampi Buddhang Saranang Gacchami Dutiyampi Dhammang Saranang Gacchami Dutiyampi Sanghang Saranang Gacchami Tatiyampi Buddhang Saranang Gacchami Tatiyampi Dhammang Saranang Gacchami Tatiyampi Sanghang Saranang Gacchami. Panchasila Anatipata Veramani Sikkhapadang Samadhiyami Adinadana Veramani Sikkhapadang Samadhiyami Kamesu Michachara Veramani Sikkhapadang Samadhiyami Musavada Veramani Sikkhapadang Samadhiyami Sura Meraya Majapamadatana Veramani Sikkhapadang Samadhiyami. So over these 2 nights, we are reviewing the 4 Satipaṭṭhānas, getting an overview of the whole thing. And yesterday we did the first 3 Satipaṭṭhānas, body, feeling, heart, mind, and saw how basically they constitute a complete framework for the whole thing. And then leaving the question, so what's the role of the 4th? What's the 4th one doing? And this is what we're going to look at tonight. But basically, the 4th one is the most complex, and you could basically give talks for a week on it. but I'm just giving the executive summary with one. So what we're going to focus on is one aspect of it, which is that it provides a framework for understanding our experience, which that the Buddha provides. So this brings us to an issue that we've been kind of working with, playing with throughout the retreat, and we've mentioned directly a couple of times in passing. And that's the idea of a framework, a conceptual framework of the Dharma, or what the Buddha calls Dhamma in Pali. So Satipaṭṭhāna is mindfulness meditation, but it's not just about cultivating mindfulness. That's not the be all and the end all of it. We cultivate mindfulness for a purpose. And as part of this purpose, the idea is that mindfulness matures into understanding. So the idea of insight. So often mindfulness meditation, insight meditation, is often spoken of as if they're the same thing. They're very close, for sure. So understanding comes from an appreciation of context. And the context that we're working in when we do this practice is that of the Buddha Dharma, or the Buddha Dhamma in Pali. In other words, the Dharma taught by the Buddha. You notice I use the word Dharma rather than Dhamma. Dhamma is the Pali word. Dharma is the English word. So that's why I prefer to use it. It's also the Sanskrit word, but English borrows words. And generally, in some cases, in terms of Buddhism, it'll borrow words from Sanskrit, and sometimes it borrows from English. And what we've done is basically, in English, we use the word Dharma. So Dharma is now an English word, like Buddha is an English word. So that's why I'm using it. Now, the purpose, so the Buddha Dharma, this is the Buddha's theoretical framework for understanding what's going on. In other words, it's the theoretical framework, the set of concepts that enable us to make meaning from our experience. So we have theory and practice. Now, why do we need a theoretical framework? Why is that necessary? This is probably a question not often raised in Malaysia, but sometimes it is. But it's often raised in, for example, Australia, where sometimes people will say, look, I'm not interested in Buddhism. I don't want to become a Buddhist. Don't go all Buddhisty on me. I just want to learn meditation. So let's put aside all the theoretical stuff and we'll just do the meditation. And the problem with that attitude or that demand is that it is impossible. It is impossible to present a meditation practice without a theoretical framework. Even if you say this practice has no theoretical framework, that's a theoretical framework. And in fact, if you have a meditation practice, you have certain instructions, do this, don't do that. Why? It's because behind it, there's a theoretical framework that says doing this is a good idea because that leads to whatever, and doing that is a bad idea because it leads in the other direction. There's always a theoretical framework. It's just a question of whether we acknowledge it or don't. So we need a theoretical framework. And one way of looking at why we need it is because if you look at what happens when we practice mindfulness, what are we experiencing? What we have is a whole series of discrete experiences, discrete events that come and go. So there's this event comes and goes, this event comes and goes. So there's sensation, 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 thought, sensation, feeling, concept, sensation, ... There's a whole series of individual events that take place over time. Now imagine you have a very wide canvas and you're holding a brush And each experienced event that you undergo in the meditation practice is like you dip your brush into the ink and you go dot on the canvas. You create a big dot. And as time goes by, you get a lot of dots. But they're just dots. Until at some point you step back and you, as we say in English, see the dots. You step back and recognize that all these dots are forming a pattern. And it's the pattern that provides understanding. So when we do the practice, we're studying the flow of experience in the hope, in the expectation that at some point we'll see a pattern emerging. We'll start to join the dots. And that's where there is understanding. So meaning comes from seeing and understanding the patterns that emerge within our lives. And patterns have to be read in some way in order to be understood. So what we want is, we're doing the meditation practice. Are we doing it because we want to change the way that we live? We want to live in a more satisfactory way. And in order to do that, we have to have some way of reading the experience. Now, what's the significance of this experience as opposed to that experience? So let's take a classic example of the understanding of impermanence, anicca. So for the Buddha, this is really important. When the Buddha talks about insight, what he's talking about is insight into the three universal characteristics: anicca, dukkha, anatta. So anicca is impermanence, usually translated impermanence, but change, instability, unreliability. Dukkha is pain, unsatisfactoriness, anguish, sorrow, etc. And anatta is not self. And they're always listed in that order. So we always start with the first one, anicca, impermanence. And for the Buddha, the understanding of impermanence is really important, because that's the gateway into insight, understanding, realization, enlightenment. And understanding here would be the Pali word jnana. So those of you who are familiar with Mahasi method, in the classic Mahasi method, may be familiar with this idea of the vipassana jnanas, the vipassana insights, or the insight knowledges. They're sometimes translated. A jnana literally means knowing, a knowing. So one important jnana is the knowing of impermanence, of change. Now, if we look at this question, do we have to be meditators to know that things change? Well, obviously not. I mean, it's obvious that things change. You don't have to be a meditator to figure this out. Now, as I do my meditation practice, I notice that things change. Everybody notices that things change. In this tradition, you may have a teacher who keeps banging on about it and keeps saying, see, it's changing. See that? Change, change, change. So you get the impression that somehow it's important. But, frankly, so what? So things are changing. So what? What the Buddha regards as insight into change or impermanence emerges when we realize that without any exception, everything changes. That's the insight, that's the jnana, that's the knowledge, the understanding that he's aiming at. That with no exception, everything changes. And this is how it's expressed in a brief verse that pops up again and again in the early teachings. And it expresses the first breakthrough into awakening. So in technical language, this is this is stream entry, the first stage of awakening. Often it's called the Dharma eye. So the Dharma eye opens, one sees the Dharma. And this is in English, it goes, whatever is of the nature to arise, all that is of the nature to cease. Whatever is of the nature to arise, all that is of the nature to cease. And you could say that if you understand what that verse is talking about, you've attained some level of enlightenment. Now, if you look at this verse, what is it trying to express? It's saying everything that arises ceases. So everything that has a beginning has an end. And the emphasis is on the everything. Now, what things have beginnings? What would that be? If you're thinking about experiences that have beginnings, what would they be? Well, everything. All experiences have a beginning. And everything that begins ends. So it changes, it's impermanent. Here today, gone tomorrow, as they say. Now, how can we know that everything that begins ends? Like, how can we do this? How can we possibly experience this? Well, the short answer is we can't. Because we can't experience everything. That's impossible. Now, it may be that I can practice for 50 years and that every experience I pay attention to that arises also ceases. And I might be ticking the box. Every single experience that I see in my meditation practice that has a beginning has an end. And I could go for decade after decade, and the books that I'm recording this in are getting bigger and bigger, and they fill a library. But how can I be sure that all those experiences that I have not attended to are the same? Because no matter how much I meditate, there's more experiences in my life that I have not been paying attention to than there are that I have been paying attention to. How do I know that it's true for them? How do I know that it's going to be true for all the experiences of the future? How do I know that it's true for everybody else's experience? I don't experience their experience. How do I know what's going on for them? Because at some point I realize that I'm not just seeing this event followed by this event, followed by this event. I'm understanding the nature of experience itself as revealed by the patterns of these events. In other words, I realize it is in the nature of experience itself that any experience event begins and then ends. It's structural, it's not content. The content of the event makes no difference to the fundamental fact that events themselves begin and end. So this is this is a shift from, you could say, the personal to the universal. So this is quite fundamental. It's the understanding of experience itself. And this is why you get whatever is of the nature to arise, all that is of the nature to cease. This is what it's getting at. I once heard, this is what we're talking about is inference. So we are inferring from what we experience. Everything I experience is impermanent, that everything is impermanent. Now, there are a lot of philosophers who would say that's very bad logic, like that's seriously bad logic. And the classic example that I heard, which I thought was quite good, it said, imagine you're an empirical philosopher and you want to make an experiment. You've heard that jumping off a tall building can be very bad for your health, but you want to test this hypothesis. So you take the elevator up to the top of a 100-story building, you walk to the edge and you jump off. And you have a notebook and you're studying inference. So you fall past the 100th floor and so far everything's fine. So tick that, that's okay. You fall past the 99th floor. Yeah, no problem, tick. You fall past the 98th floor. I don't know what everybody's worried about. And you keep going, you keep ticking the boxes. Now, by the time you've only got 10 floors to go, you're feeling pretty confident that all those people who said this is a bad idea are wrong. Of course, it's not long after that you go splat. And if you're still conscious, you realize actually they were right. There is a problem. So this is the problem with inference. But when the Buddha's talking about inference, he's not saying that you don't go splat if you jump off a building, because you see in that inference, what it's about is the content of experience. If I'm falling and I feel okay at this floor and this floor and this floor and this floor, then I'll keep feeling okay. It's about the content of experience. But the Buddha's talking about the structure of experience. So when you go splat, does the experience of splat have a beginning? Yes. Does it have an end? Yes. It's the same structure. Do you get the distinction? So it's bigger than the content of the experience. So this is where understanding in the Buddha's sense of the word starts to emerge. And this is the entry into the understanding of the three characteristics. So as we practice, at some point it begins to click. And when this happens, cannot be predicted. And we begin to recognize that the Buddha was right when he talked about impermanence as a structural aspect of experience itself. And then we realize he got it right when he said that this radical impermanence is painful. Because we begin to realize in a felt, intimate sense, that if everything is changing, then nothing is under our control. And the recognition of that is always a shock. For some people, it's a big shock. For others, it's relatively minor. It varies greatly from person to person. So this is the painful quality of the recognition of change. I was thinking, what examples can I give? And I thought, if you're in any doubt about the painful quality of the recognition of change, just ask your elderly friends, relatives, or neighbors. They will let you in on the secret. It does get painful. But another example might be, which I mentioned before, the statement of a friend of mine who worked with immigrants and refugees. We were discussing her work, and she said, eventually, we are all immigrants. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, have you ever heard someone complain, this is not the country I was born in? And you realize that actually is a very common complaint. And what they're talking about is the fact of change and the fact that this change is not under their control. And that causes pain. So this is dukkha. And then that segues into anatta, not self. And I'm not going to talk about this because that would swallow up the rest of the evening and into the next several days. So that's huge. So I'm going to avoid that one. I just take my word for it. But the point here is, notice that these three characteristics, anicca, dukkha, anatta, they function as a theoretical framework that's designed to allow us to read our experience in a particular way, in a certain way, in order to create a coherent universe that allows us to flourish. Now, notice that this universe it's creating is a conceptual universe. And so, we've been talking about concepts as bad, 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 but actually here, concepts are just concepts. And here, they also have a very positive function. So it's like what we're doing is constructing a conceptual universe. And this is the purpose of the Buddha Dharma, the Dharma as in the Buddha's teaching of, so the Buddha Dharma in the sense of the teaching of the Buddha. So what the Buddha Dharma gives us is, first of all, a practice that cultivates a certain way of attending to experience, a certain way of paying attention to experience. And we call this our meditation method. Now, we mentioned at the beginning of the retreat, and of course, all of you who are experienced meditators are well aware there's a multitude of meditation techniques. And what we've been doing here is a tiny, 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 tiny little sample based on a particular lineage within a particular tradition within the broader stream of Buddhism. Each meditation experience each meditation method shapes our experience in particular ways and sends our experience off in particular directions. In other words, if you meditate this way, you head off down that path and you will have these kinds of experiences. You meditate that way, you head off down this other path, you have another set of experiences. So we are shaping our experience through the meditation method. And different methods shape experience in different ways and take us in different directions. In other words, there may be many paths up the mountain top, but not all paths are heading to the mountaintop. Some paths are heading to another mountaintop. So we're shaping our experience through the method. And as we do this, we're given a theoretical framework that explains why we are doing this, what it's meant to achieve, and which interprets the different experiences that arise as we go along this path. And it's this that gives us a shared language that enables us to speak about our experience. And you notice that what you've been doing over this past week, you have been learning a language. So just to give one example plucked out of the air, several times, and although it's not on any of my scripts, we have talked about the Pali word piti, rapture, and talked about, what is it? How does the Buddha define it? Where does it fit in the meditation method? Now that word, that concept has come up because people have certain experiences. I'm meditating and I start to sway back and forth. So what's going on? What is that question asking? I'm having an experience, a particular experience. Why am I having that experience? Because I'm doing this particular meditation method. Now, you, as the alleged expert, you tell me what it means. You interpret the experience. Give me a concept, a word, piti, in Pali, rapture. Tell me what it is. Show me where it fits and whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Should I be happy or should I be worried? And we're doing this again and again and again. So this gives us a shared language. So you create a community that can communicate to each other about their experience, and it gives us a set of values, like what's important, what's not important, what should be developed, what should be abandoned. All of this is provided by the conceptual framework, the theoretical framework, which is the Buddha Dharma. Now, of course, with this, there is plenty of room for disagreement. There's no one theoretical framework. There's different theoretical frameworks. So different traditions have different styles of practice, and they read their results in different ways. So to give you one example that struck me at the time, many years ago when I was studying Sanskrit at the Australian National University, each year the Sanskrit students and the staff would have a Sanskrit barbecue. It was a very exclusive social event. Only Sanskrit scholars need come. And during my first Sanskrit barbecue, which was, I would never forget this because it was the only time I've been intimate with a wombat. It was held at a property outside of Canberra, and it was owned by one of the Sanskrit professors, a very eccentric woman, and she liked wombats. And there happened to be a wombat in her living room, and she needed the wombat removed from the house, and she asked me, could you carry the wombat out down there where the wombat holes are so he can go home? So I picked him up and carried him out. It was the only time in my life I've ever carried a wombat. It was really interesting. But I was having a chat at this Sanskrit barbecue with one of the students who was a woman who was a very senior practitioner in Transcendental Meditation, TM, and she was a teacher in it. So I was curious about her meditation tradition, completely different from mine. And so I asked her in the course of discussion, I said, so when you meditate, what do you actually experience? And to my surprise, she told me. And I said, wow, that sounds really good. That's emptiness. And she was quite upset. She frowned and she said, and she corrected me. And she said, that's not emptiness, that's fullness. So it sounded to me like exactly the same experience. She's coming out of a Hindu tradition. For her, that is fullness. I'm coming out of a Buddhist tradition. To me, that's emptiness. It's harder to think of two concepts more opposite each other, yet the experience is exactly the same. So how we read the experience is significant, and it varies from one tradition to another. Another example, which is more kind of perhaps more pragmatic, you get in within the traditions, particularly the Indian traditions, the idea of non-duality, Advaita. And this is very important in some Indian traditions. And in these traditions, they see a clear division. There's non-dual traditions and there's dualist traditions. And there's no doubt that the non-dual is superior to the dual. And there are, if you look at a number of teachers and quite experienced meditators who have gone through their basic boot camp training in the Mahasi lineage, doing the Mahasi method, have abandoned it, has walked away from it, because they've said all this business about noting and making effort to note the object is dualistic, because there's a strong sense of someone here who's making the effort to note the object. And so they say the deeper I got into this practice, the stronger the sense of self developed. And I got trapped in this duality. And then I realized I was doing the wrong thing. And so I moved to another tradition, which was non-dual, where I could meditate without that sense of the person doing the meditation, and this is obviously better. So you get that, for example, in Chinese Buddhism, Chan, they would be a non-dual tradition. And you also get these streams in Tibetan Buddhism that see themselves as non-dual, and they have quite distinctive forms of meditation practice. So if you go into Tibetan Buddhism, you do Dzogchen, for example, which is quite popular, or Mahamudra. These would be classified as non-dual traditions, and the people in those traditions regard them as superior to dualistic meditation methods, and often they will classify Mahasi method as being dualistic. So again, you've got theoretical frameworks, you've got a style of practice, you've got a theoretical framework, and they can clash. They can say, look, yours is inferior to mine, or whatever. So it's not that there's one theoretical framework, and it's not that there's one way of doing a meditation practice. And whichever one you go down, you're going to have a different set of experiences and a different way of reading the experiences. So here we're looking at the Buddha's way of looking at things. Now, in the Satipaṭṭhāna Sutta, we come to his theoretical framework in the Fourth Satipaṭṭhāna. So this has been a long preamble. So with the first three, we've talked about how we start with body, we move into feeling and citta, and this is a journey which opens us up to the cultivation of ethical sensitivity. We're becoming increasingly sensitive to what it is that we're doing in terms of how we live our lives. So we begin by being grounded in body, and therefore being grounded in the present, which is the foundation. And then we cultivate a sensitivity to the affective tone of experience. So is this experience pleasant, prompting me to hold on to it? Is it unpleasant or painful, prompting me to resist or avoid or reject it? Is it neither painful nor pleasant, prompting us to ignore it or to be doubtful or confused about it? And then as we do this, we become increasingly sensitive to the state of the heart mind, the citta. We begin to see what drives us and how we construct our own lives. And so we begin to recognize what are the drives and the choices that we're undergoing that create greater suffering, and what are the drives and the choices that lessen that suffering. So as the Buddha once expressed it with a question, he said, what, having done it, will bring me harm and suffering over the long term, and what will bring me welfare and happiness over the long term? So this is what these first three Satipaṭṭhānas are leading us to. In the Fourth Satipaṭṭhāna, the Buddha takes this a step further, and what he does is he presents us with a number of schemas that help us recognize what we're supposed to abandon and what we're supposed to cultivate, and how to recognize what these are. This is what, and so just going briefly through, so he gives us a series of lists. Now, again, this is an oral tradition. So things are meant to be chanted, and they're basically what you chant, what you memorize is the kind of the executive summary, as it were, and each of these things is meant to be unpacked in commentary. So he begins with the list of what should be abandoned. So these are our obstacles, our obsessions. And the list is the 5 hindrances: sense desire, malice or hatred, stiffness and dullness, restlessness and worry, and paralytic doubt. These are the classic 5 hindrances. Then he balances that with the list of what should be cultivated, the qualities that move us towards awakening. And these are the 7 factors of awakening: mindfulness, investigation of phenomena, energy, rapture, tranquility, concentration, equanimity. And those of you who are familiar with Buddhist teaching know about these lists. He then gives us another two schemas. And these are two interlocking but quite distinctive ways of exploring the human condition, of how to view the human condition. And these are the five bundles or the aggregates and the six sense fields. So the five bundles or the five aggregates, these are body, feeling, perception, choices, awareness, which we've talked about briefly. And these represent those aspects of experience that we use to construct a sense of an independent self, an identity that is radically separate from the world, and gives us a sense of certainty, permanence, and so on. And so these five, these are the five aggregates, or the five bundles are the raw materials from which we construct an identity. And you notice that of the five, four are mental and one is physical. So this is predominantly mental. Then he talks about the six sense fields. This is an alternative schema, but it interlocks with the first one. These are the six sensitivities of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, minding. And this list focuses on our sensitivities, on our relationship to the world that we experience through the senses, and our tendency to become emotionally entangled with our experiences, our tendency to drown in the ocean of affect, of feeling. And notice that of these, five are physical and one is mental. So it's a different emphasis. One is predominantly mental, the other is predominantly physical. And then finally, the Buddha presents the four truths, which is a basic a schema that summarizes the whole package. So the four truths are dukkha, its arising, its cessation, and the path leading to its cessation. So these schemas that he presents, bang, 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 represent ways of reading our experience and guiding us through the path and telling us what things mean and what's worthwhile, what's worth doing, what's worth not doing. So let's, how much time have we got? Let's go through at least some of them briefly. This is all boom, boom, what to do. As I said, I could spend a week just on this fourth Satipaṭṭhāna. So we're doing the executive summary. So your head may be spinning by this time, but don't worry, it'll spin even more by the time it's over. So let's look at the first two. Let's focus on those. So the first schema are the five hindrances, the nivarana. And these are called the hindrances because they hinder or obstruct our development in the meditation practice. They are what gets in the way. So, and they are essentially imbalances in the heart and the mind. So the first pair are sense desire and ill will or hatred. And these represent an imbalance in affect, where the heart is entangled. So they're of the heart. So the heart is entangled with experience, and it tries to either grab it and hold it and possess it. I must have this, must make this mine, or reject or destroy it on the other. I've got to get rid of this. So this is an imbalance in the heart. The next pair are stiffness and dullness, usually translated or traditionally translated sloth and torpor. You may be more familiar with that one. I prefer stiffness and dullness, but we don't have time to go into why. So stiffness and dullness on the one hand, and restlessness and worry on the other. These represent an imbalance of energy. So stiffness and dullness, not enough energy. Restlessness and worry, too much energy. So swinging between too much and not enough energy. I'm sure you're familiar with these ones. And the final hindrance is doubt, vicikicca, but specifically doubt that paralyzes. So I always translate it as paralytic doubt. And this is it's the kind of doubt that makes any kind of commitment to a course of action impossible. I can't do it. I mean, people say that meditation is a good idea, but what if they're wrong? But, you know, my friends say that meditation has really helped them, but I don't know, they still seem pretty screwed up to me. You know, they say that all these scientific studies have been done that proves meditation is really good for you. Yeah, but some of those studies are pretty dodgy. You know, meditation is the thing. Yeah, for hippies. Oh, and so, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and paralyzed, can't act, can't do anything because of doubt. This is an imbalance of will or choice or decision. So you have an imbalance of the heart, the first two, imbalance of energy, the second two, and an imbalance of the will, which is the fifth. And in all cases, the Buddha gives the instruction what to do about these. And in all cases, first of all, learn to notice when they are present. So learn to recognize them. Then learn to recognize when they're absent, which is more subtle. In other words, am I in a state of balance or not? And if I'm not, what is the nature of my imbalance? And then he advises us to learn an understanding what causes the arising of this imbalance. Where does this imbalance come from? And then from there we learn how to let go of it, how to abandon it and come back into balance. And finally, how do we outgrow it so that we can feel genuinely free from it? So this is the first schema. The second schema are the 7 aspects of awakening, the Bojjhanga. So this is what moves us towards awakening. The first one is mindfulness, which we've talked about a lot. The second is investigation of phenomena, or simply curiosity. In practice, it's often just curiosity. And you notice, first of all, that mindfulness and investigation or curiosity are very strongly linked. One is listed after the other. You notice how we've been talking about investigate, check what's going on, clarify the experience. It's stimulating this second factor. And that's why we're saying it, because this is the schema. This is the framework. Then come 3 qualities that indicate a quickening meditation practice, like things are starting to happen in the meditation practice. First is rapture, piti, which we've already spoken about. This is a delighted interest in what the mind is attending to. And it manifests also in the body as some kind of agitation or movement. Then you get tranquility, passaddhi. Now this is, as the practice develops, this agitation calms down, and passaddhi is predominantly physical. So the body calms down. Mind is also calming down, but this is mostly body. And then you get samadhi, concentration or integration, and this is the mind. So you get a movement from you feeling a lot of energy through to feeling calm and still, and a movement from the body to the mind, from the gross to the subtle. And then finally at the end comes equanimity or balance. This is when heart and mind are balanced in any circumstances. And you notice that in this list, the first member of the list is mindfulness and the last is equanimity. Now, when the Buddha uses lists a lot, and he constructs the lists very carefully. And often you get, if you have a list, often you'll see a pattern where you'll see the first member of the list and the last one of the list join. And they, as it were, hold the rest of it together. So you have mindfulness, equanimity. And these, of course, are very closely associated with each other. And Mindfulness is essentially cognitive, it's up here. Equanimity is essentially of the heart. So it's also a unification of head and heart, cognitive and affective. If you look at the list of the Eightfold Path, for example, at one end, view, at the other end, samadhi, head, heart, understanding, release of the heart, serenity, insight, serenity. So again, you have a balancing, and you get the same thing in this list. And as with the hindrances, the Buddha advises us, first of all, learn to recognize these qualities, get to know them when they are present, and therefore get to notice when they're absent. And he also advises us to see what gives rise to these qualities. So how can I cultivate these qualities? What nourishes them? Because this is what I should be doing. How can I make them part of my normal life experience? So if you look at these first two schemas, which is looking at those tonight, because we've got too much. The hindrances, the aspects of awakening, or the factors of awakening. Working with the hindrances, we learn to abandon them. We are abandoning the unwholesome. Working with the aspects of awakening, they are wholesome. We are cultivating the wholesome. So let's look at the Buddha's question regarding how we should live in order to enjoy a fully flourishing life. This comes out of Lakkhana Sutta, number 30 in Digha Nikaya. The Buddha says, what is wholesome? What is unwholesome? What is praiseworthy? What is blamable? What ought I to do? What ought I not to do? What, having done it, will bring me harm and suffering over the long term? And what will bring me welfare and happiness over the long term? So this represents his essential project. This, we could say, is his version of the universal ethical question that all human beings are faced with, which can be, summarized as, how should I live? ? Now, all of us are faced with this question, and all of us have worked out, or are working out, an answer to it. It's the way that we live. This is the Buddha's version of it. So you notice he begins with what is wholesome, what is unwholesome. And the first two schemas in the Fourth Satipaṭṭhāna, he's presenting those and laying them out, at least certain aspects of them. It's not complete, but it's certain aspects. What is praiseworthy? What is blamable? Now, this one is interesting because this one is a shift from the individual to the social. So the Buddha is saying, we're not doing this alone. We're doing this in a community, and in particular, in a community which includes people we look up to and respect, and whose opinions we value. And basically, these are people who we respect and who we want to earn their respect. We want them to respect us. So we're going to think very, very carefully before we do anything that they would say, that is really, really tacky. You really shouldn't do that. So there's a social dimension to all of this, not just individual, but social as well. What ought I to do? What ought I not to do? So here we have the classic kind of ethical problem. And he expands this. He says, what, having done it, will bring me harm and suffering over the long term? And what will bring me welfare and happiness over the long term? So you notice that the focus is on how to move away from harm and suffering towards welfare and happiness. But you notice that he's got a long-term view. Like something may be pretty attractive in the short term, but in the long term, it may not be such a good idea. Now, what this question is doing is presenting us with a framework. it's giving us a sense of what's the nature of our project and what should we do about it. The fourth Satipaṭṭhāna is filling out this framework. It's adding content to it. And so the Buddha is guiding us what to look for and how to respond to what we find, and the overall sense of why we're doing this, where it all fits. So this is the fourth Satipaṭṭhāna, at least one aspect of it. It gives us a framework within which we can make sense of our meditation experience and what we experience in our everyday lives. And you notice that the Buddha's project is essentially ethical, in that he wants to show us how to live fully flourishing lives. That's his project. And to do that, we need to let go of what causes harm and suffering and cultivate what causes welfare and happiness. And to do that, we need to sort out what's actually happening in our own experience and how we create our own pain. So we need to understand the patterns of our lives, and we need to understand the values we need to develop if we are going to move in this direction and flourish. So this is what the Buddha Dharma as the teaching gives us. And this in the Satipaṭṭhāna, that this is where it's found. It's in the fourth Satipaṭṭhāna. Okay, that's enough for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, for the Dharma talk. Fellow yogis and brothers and sisters who join us on Facebook Live, tonight's Dharma talk has ended. Thank you for joining us, and also a big thank you to those who follow this series of Dharma talk by Patrick from the beginning. This is the last Dharma talk by Patrick in this virtual retreat. Please do click like on our Facebook so that you'll be alerted for future live streaming. I will now stop the live streaming. Thank you.